I don't talk about 1977, ever. If I had my way, I'd scrub that year clean from my memory. But some things don't stay buried. They claw their way back, no matter how deep you try to push them down. My name is Allison Jacobs, and I'm the only one left alive to tell you what happened to my family. It all started with my brother William. He was only 8. I can still see him, running across Main Street, his red baseball cap flying off in the wind. He didn't see the truck. He never stood a chance. After the accident, my mom, she was never the same. She spent days locked in her room, clutching William's clothes and sobbing into his pillow. The house felt like a tomb. Harrisville wasn't the kind of town where tragedies went unnoticed. Everyone knew everyone else's business. It was small, quaint, and dotted with colonial-era buildings that seemed to trap the past in their walls. My dad had left us years earlier, so when William died, it was just me and Mom in that creaky old farmhouse at the edge of town. People would stop by with casseroles and condolences, but their pity only seemed to deepen the silence that had fallen over our home. The farmhouse itself had a history, one that people didn't like to talk about openly. It was built in the late 1800s on the outskirts of Harrisville, close to the woods where local legends claimed witches were hanged during the 1700s. Neighbors whispered about the land being cursed. As a kid, I used to laugh it off. But after William died, the house felt darker, heavier, like it was feeding off our grief. Mom, Janet Jacobs, wasn't always like this. She used to be full of life, a second-grade teacher who baked cookies for every holiday and had a laugh that could light up a room. But William's death broke something in her. I tried to help, tried to be there for her. But how does a 13-year-old girl fix a mother's shattered heart? My dad, Michael, left us when I was 7. He was a traveling salesman who decided one day that the open road was more appealing than his family. I hated him for it, still do. After he left, William became my best friend. We'd explore the woods behind the house, pretending to be pirates searching for treasure. I think that's why his death hit me so hard. I lost my brother, my best friend, and the only person who made me feel less alone in that big empty house. Harrisville was the kind of town where time seemed to stand still. It had one main street with a diner, a hardware store, and a library that smelled like mildew. The people were friendly enough, but there was always an undercurrent of unease, as if the town itself carried the weight of its history. There were stories. Every small town has them. Kids would dare each other to spend the night in the old mill on the outskirts of town, claiming it was haunted by the spirits of workers who died in a fire. The woods were said to be home to the Whispering Woman, a ghost who lured children to their deaths. And then there was our house. Mrs. Hargrove, our elderly neighbor, once told me that no one stayed in that house for long. She said it was cursed, that the land it stood on was stained with blood. As a kid, I thought she was just trying to scare me. But after William's death, I started to wonder if there was more to her stories than I'd realized. Then one afternoon, Mom's friend Carol came over. Carol always had a knack for sticking her nose where it didn't belong. She brought over this glossy magazine and shoved it into my mom's hands. "Janet," she said, "these reborn dolls are all the rage. They're lifelike, comforting. People say they can really help with grief." Carol wasn't exactly subtle, but she meant well. She'd lost her own husband in a factory accident a few years earlier and had thrown herself into every self-help trend she could find. Mom brushed her off at first, but grief has a way of twisting your thoughts, convincing you to do things you'd never dream of. A week later, the box arrived. It was huge, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Mom called it a custom order, one of the first reborn dolls made in America. She said the artist had used a special kit to make it look just like William. That should have been the first red flag. When she opened the box, I swear the air in the room got colder. The doll looked wrong. Its eyes were too glassy, its skin too pale. It wasn't William, but Mom didn't care. She cradled it like a real baby, whispering to it, humming lullabies. She named it Billy. After the doll arrived, I started to research reborn dolls. They were a new trend back then, and information was scarce. But I found an article in the library that mentioned an artist named Marjorie Whittaker, who who specialized in creating hyper-realistic dolls. According to the article, Marjorie believed her creations were more than art, they were vessels. I dug deeper and found a letter in our attic addressed to Mom. It was from Marjorie herself. She wrote about how she had poured her heart and soul into creating Billy, claiming he was her finest work. But there was something off about the letter. She mentioned rituals and binding a soul to the innocent. It made my skin crawl. At first, it was just unsettling. Mom would set the doll at the dinner table, tucking a napkin under its chin. She'd talk to it, like it could talk back. One night, I heard her reading bedtime stories to it. But then, things started happening. Strange things. The first time, I thought I was imagining it. I'd come home from school, and Billy would be sitting in a different spot than where Mom had left him. Sometimes his head would tilt just slightly, like he was watching me. I told myself it was Mom moving him around, but deep down, I knew better. One night, I woke up to the sound of shuffling. My bedroom door was open. It had been closed when I went to sleep. And there, in the dim light of the hallway, was Billy, sitting upright. His glassy eyes seemed to glint in the dark. I screamed. Mom came running, scooping the doll up like it was a real baby. That's when I realized she wasn't just grieving anymore. She was losing herself to that thing. By November, the house felt alive, but not in a good way. Doors would slam shut, lights flickered, the old rocking chair in the corner of the living room would creak back and forth on its own. One night, I found claw marks on my bedroom wall. They were small, like a child's. Mom said I was imagining things, but I wasn't. Mrs. Hargrove became my confidant during this time. She told me stories about Harrisville's dark past, about the witch trials and the curses supposedly laid on the land. One day, she showed me an old journal she had found in her attic. It belonged to a woman named Abigail Williams, one of the accused witches. Abigail wrote about binding spirits to objects to protect her family. My blood ran cold when I saw a drawing in the journal. It was a doll, eerily similar to Billy. About 2 nights later, I heard a noise coming from the basement. It was a low, rhythmic thumping. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. The air was damp and heavy, and the beam of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. That's when I saw it. Billy was sitting on the old rocking chair in the corner, moving back and forth on his own. His glassy eyes seemed to follow me as I stepped closer. The closer I got, the colder the air became. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. I ran upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. But when I turned back, Mom was standing there, holding a knife. "Stay away from him," Mom said to me. "You're not taking him from me, sweetheart." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were wild, as if possessed by some unseen entity. I knew then that I couldn't stay in that house. Not with her. Not with him. Not with it. That night, I packed a bag and tried to leave. But as I crept down the stairs, the front door slammed shut on its own. I heard laughter, high-pitched and childlike, echoing through the house. Billy was sitting at the bottom of the stairs, his head tilted, a twisted grin on his face. I swear his mouth hadn't been painted like that before. Mom suddenly appeared behind me, blocking my way. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken. She held the knife tightly, her knuckles white. "You don't understand, Allison," she whispered to me in a strange, croaky voice. "He needs us. He's part of this family." For a moment, I froze. My mother wasn't there anymore. Not the woman who used to bake cookies and laugh with me and William. This was someone else. Something else. When I took a step back, Billy's head jerked slightly as if reacting to my hesitation. The room grew impossibly cold, and the shadows around us seemed to stretch and twist like they were alive. I had to get out. I took a step back, my eyes darting between the knife in Mom's hand and the doll at her feet. The laughter, the childlike, mocking giggle, grew louder. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then the lights flickered. In the brief moments of darkness, I thought I saw something move, a figure, tall and grotesque, standing behind Mom. When the lights came back, it was gone. I made a split-second decision. Grabbing the candlestick from the table beside me, I swung it with everything I had. The impact knocked the knife from her hand, and she stumbled backward. I didn't wait to see what she'd do next. I bolted for the door. As I ran, I heard her screaming. No, not her. Something else. It was a guttural, inhuman sound that made my skin crawl. I didn't stop running until I reached Mrs. Hargrove's house. Mrs. Hargrove took me in that night. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, the house was empty. Mom was gone. Billy was gone. That was the last time I ever saw them again. Police discovered the basement was a total mess. Walls scratched up, furniture overturned, but there was no sign of them. Nothing. It was as if they vanished into thin air. The official story was that Mom had a mental breakdown and ran off, taking the doll with her, abandoning her only daughter. But I knew better. For weeks, I stayed with Mrs. Hargrove, too afraid to go back to the house or anywhere near it. I started having horrible nightmares, insidious visions of Billy, of my mother's pale, hollow face, of that ominous figure in the shadows, the glint of its milky eyes fixed on me. I'd wake up screaming, lathered in a cold sweat, the sound of that evil laughter echoing in my ears. Months later, while cleaning up the attic at Mrs. Hargrove's, I found another journal. This one was older, the pages brittle with age. It belonged to Marjorie Whittaker, the doll maker. In her spidery handwriting, she described her masterpiece, a doll that could hold a soul. She wrote about binding rituals, sacrifices, and the perfect vessel. The last entry sent chills down my spine. It read, "The doll is ready, but it needs more. It craves more. It will never stop." I realized then that Billy wasn't just a doll. He was a doorway, and my family had opened it. After Child Protection Services allowed Mrs. Hargrove to officially be my caretaker and legal custodian, I left Harrisville as soon as I turned 18. In fact, I did so on the eve of my birthday. I also changed my name and moved to a city far away. I tried to start over, but no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the terrible memories. Was Mom still alive? Where was she? What if she's still out there? What if she's not alone? Despite trying to track her down years later, unfortunately, they were questions I would never find answers to. She disappeared with Billy, never to be seen or heard from again. Yet to this very day, I still get the feeling I'm being watched. At night, I sometimes hear faint giggles coming from the shadows. Once I found a tiny handprint on my bathroom mirror, too small to be my own. I don't know if I'll ever truly be free from this dark presence and the entity associated with it. But I do know one thing. Some things should never be brought into this world, and some dolls should never be made.
My name is Claire Hargrove, and I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. That changed the day I found the diary. It was late October when I stumbled into Rosewood Antiquities, a shop as unassuming as it was unsettling. I was always drawn to old things. I'm not really sure why, but the history of innate objects and their journeys always fascinated me. The sky outside was a canvas of dull grey, rain streaking down in cold sheets, and the store, with its dim lighting and musty smell, felt like a refuge. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just killing time while waiting for the storm to pass. But as my fingers grazed over aged porcelain dolls, tarnished jewellery, and cracked leather tomes, my eyes caught sight of it. It was tucked on a low shelf, almost hidden as if on purpose. A leather-bound diary, its cover darkened with age, embossed with a faded floral motif, reminiscent of London's Victorian era. 1830s, I immediately thought, possibly slightly older. The ornate brass clasp holding it shut was tarnished but still functional. When I picked it up, a faint chill ran through my hands, as if the diary had been resting in a cooler climate than the rest of the shop. "That isn't for sale," the shopkeeper rasped, her voice startling me. I looked up, still clutching the diary. She was a small woman of Slavic descent, with a thin and brittle frame. Her gnarled fingers looked like twisted branches, and her hair was grey, swept back into a loose bun. An attempt to look bookish, I presumed. Her milky green eyes seemed to look past me rather than directly at me. "Why not?" I asked, doing everything I could to not sound rude. She hesitated, then muttered, "It brings bad luck, always has. I've tried to get rid of it, but it keeps finding its way back to me." I should have listened, but there was something about the diary that felt magnetic, like it had been waiting for me. It had a story to tell, and it wanted me to be the one to read it. "I'll take my chances," I said, ignoring her warning. She grumbled something in her native tongue, her bony fingers trembling as she rang up the sale. "If you must have it, just remember, some stories should never be told." I politely thanked her and left, but her words lingered in my mind as I exited the shop, clutching the diary beneath my coat. That night I sat in my cramped apartment, the cold rain tapping persistently against the windows, and examined my find. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded and blotchy in places. However, the handwriting was exquisite, written in quill by someone who not only enjoyed recording their thoughts, but took pride in the crafting of every word. The first entry was dated January 3rd, 1874, and written in an elegant, flowing hand. "To whoever finds this, my name is Eleanor Whitlock. I write this not as a record of my life, but as a warning. I was 10 years old when my family brought the mourning doll into our home. By the time we realized the truth, it was too late. The doll had already claimed everything." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My pulse quickened as I turned the page, drawn into Eleanor's story. Eleanor Whitlock lived in London during the height of the Victorian era, a time when death lingered like a shadow over every household. Her family had been wealthy once, but by the time her story began, they were struggling to maintain their facade of prosperity. Her father, a widower, was a merchant who had recently fallen ill, leaving the family in financial ruin. Her elder sister, Margaret, had died of scarlet fever the previous year, and the loss had shattered their household. Eleanor described how her once vivacious mother had become a ghost of herself, dressing in black mourning gowns and spending hours locked in Margaret's room. It was during this time of grief that the doll arrived. Eleanor's mother had commissioned a mourning doll to be made in Margaret's likeness, a common practice among the upper classes. The doll was exquisite, with pale waxen skin, auburn hair that had once belonged to Margaret, and a white lace dress identical to the one Margaret had worn in her final portrait. Its eyes were closed, its expression serene, as though it were merely asleep. "My mother called it a comfort," Eleanor wrote. "She placed it in Margaret's crib, as if hoping it would breathe life back into our home. But from the moment it arrived, the house felt colder." Eleanor described how strange things began happening almost immediately. At first, it was small. The doll would be found in different positions than it had been left, its head slightly turned or its hands moved. Then came the sounds, soft footsteps echoing in the halls at night, the faint creak of the rocking chair in Margaret's nursery. "I told myself it was my imagination," Eleanor wrote, "but deep down I knew something was wrong. The doll wasn't just a doll, it watched us." Desperate for answers, Eleanor's mother turned to a spiritualist, a woman named Madame Thorne, who claimed to communicate with the dead. Madame Thorne convinced the family to hold a séance in the hopes of reaching Margaret's spirit. Eleanor described the night in vivid detail. The dining room was transformed, the table covered with black velvet and surrounded by candles. Madame Thorne instructed everyone to hold hands and remain silent as she called upon the spirits. At first, nothing happened. Then, the temperature in the room dropped. The candles flickered, and a faint knocking sound echoed from the walls. "Is that you, Margaret?" Madame Thorne asked. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Eleanor's mother wept, convinced it was her daughter's spirit trying to communicate. But Eleanor felt a deep sense of unease. And then the doll moved. Eleanor described how its head slowly turned, its closed eyes snapping open to reveal glassy blue orbs. The room descended into chaos, her father shouting, her mother screaming, Madame Thorne fainting. After that night, the doll's presence became malevolent. Eleanor's father fell gravely ill, plagued by nightmares and hallucinations. Objects moved on their own. Doors slammed shut without warning. The family dog, a loyal terrier named Rufus, was found dead in Margaret's crib, its body twisted as if by unseen hands. My mother refused to believe it was the doll, Eleanor wrote. She said it was Margaret, angry that we had failed to honor her memory. But I knew better. Whatever inhabited that doll was not my sister. It was something older, something evil. As the weeks went on, the Whitlock family unraveled. Eleanor's father succumbed to his illness, leaving her mother in a state of hysteria. The servants fled the house, claiming it was cursed, and Eleanor began experiencing vivid nightmares, visions of a shadowy figure standing over her bed, whispering her name. The diary detailed how Eleanor discovered a hidden compartment in the doll's base, containing a scrap of parchment covered in strange symbols. She later learned that these symbols were part of an occult ritual, one meant to bind a spirit to an object. Whoever created the doll, Eleanor wrote, did so with the intent of trapping something within it, but it was never meant to be Margaret. It was something else entirely. Eleanor's final entries were disjointed, filled with pleas for forgiveness and warnings to whoever might read her words. "The doll cannot be destroyed," she wrote. "It will find a way to survive. Please, if you're reading this, do not let it into your home. Burn this book. Forget my story. Do not make the same mistake I did. Dake." I closed the diary, my hands trembling. The storm outside had subsided, but the oppressive weight of Eleanor's story lingered in the room. I wanted to dismiss it as fiction, the ramblings of a grief-stricken girl. But as I looked around my apartment, I felt an uncanny stillness, as if I were being watched. And then I heard it, a faint creak, like the sound of a rocking chair. I turned toward the corner of the room, where the diary sat on my desk. The brass clasp had come undone, and the pages fluttered open on their own. That was when I saw it, a single word, scrawled in fresh ink at the bottom of the final page. "Hello?" I stared at the word. "Hello?" My breath hitched, and the sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears. The ink was wet, glistening under the soft glow of the desk lamp. My first instinct was to slam the diary shut, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The creaking sound grew louder, rhythmic, like the gentle sway of a rocking chair. But there was no chair in my apartment. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed darker, thicker, almost alive. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The temperature dropped, and I saw my breath fog in the air. A faint, childlike giggle echoed through the room, followed by a soft thud, like a small object hitting the floor. My eyes darted back to the desk, where the diary now lay closed, its brass clasp once again fastened. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I convinced myself that I was overtired, that I had let Eleanor's story get to me. But deep down, I knew better. The diary wasn't just a book, it was a doorway. Determined to make sense of what was happening, I began researching Victorian mourning dolls. My search led me to a local historian, Dr. Evelyn Mathers, who specialized in occult artifacts. Dr. Mathers was skeptical when I first mentioned the diary, but when I described the doll and the strange occurrences, her demeanor changed. Victorian mourning dolls were more than just effigies, she explained. In some cases, they were used as vessels, for spirits, memories, even curses. If someone with ill intent created the doll you described, they may have bound a malevolent entity to it. She showed me photographs of mourning dolls, each more unsettling than the last. Some were life-sized, their glass eyes staring blankly into the void. Others had real human hair, braided into intricate patterns. "But the symbols Eleanor described," I said, showing her a rough sketch I had made from memory. "What do they mean?" Dr. Mathers' face paled. "Those are sigils," she said. "Occult symbols used in rituals. binding, summoning, protection, or destruction. If the doll contains these markings, it was likely part of a ritual gone wrong, or perhaps one that succeeded all too well. "Can it be stopped?" I asked. She hesitated. "If the entity is tied to the doll, destroying the object might sever the connection. But if the spirit has already begun to spread its influence..." She trailed off, her expression grim. That night, the disturbances grew worse. The sound of the rocking chair returned, louder and more insistent. Objects in my apartment moved on their own. A picture frame fell from the wall, my bookshelf tipped over, spilling its contents onto the floor. And then came the whispers. They started as faint murmurs, unintelligible but persistent, like a dozen voices speaking just out of earshot. But as the hours passed, they grew louder, clearer. "Claire?" The voice was high-pitched and childlike, dripping with malice. I grabbed the diary, intending to throw it into the fireplace, but as I held it, the pages began flipping on their own. The words shifted and rearranged, forming new sentences. "You can't get rid of me." My blood ran cold. Desperate, I returned to Dr. Mathers the next day, diary in hand. She examined the book carefully, her gloved hands trembling as she traced the symbols on the inner cover. "There may be a way," she said finally, "but it's dangerous." She explained that to break the bond, we would need to recreate the original ritual that bound the entity to the doll, then sever the connection at its peak. This would require specific items: black candles, a mirror, and a circle of salt mixed with ash. "Where's the doll now?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've only read about it in the diary." Dr. Mathers frowned. "The diary is the doll. Or rather, it's what the doll has become. The spirit doesn't need a physical form. It's latched onto this book as its anchor." That night, we performed the ritual in her home, a sprawling Victorian house that felt both safe and unnervingly appropriate for such an event. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of burning sage. Dr. Mathers chanted in Latin. Her voice was steady, despite the growing tension. I stood in the center of the salt circle, clutching the diary, my hands slick with sweat. As the ritual progressed, the air grew colder. Shadows danced on the walls, their movements unnatural and erratic. The whispers returned, louder than ever, drowning out Dr. Mathers' voice. And then, the diary flew from my hands, landing open on the floor. A dark mist began to seep from its pages, coalescing into a vague human form. T was the doll, life-size now, its waxen face twisted into a grotesque mockery of Margaret's serene expression. "You can't stop me," it hissed, its voice a guttural growl that made my ears ache. Dr. Mathers shouted instructions, but her words were lost in the chaos. The entity lunged at me, its glassy eyes burning with malevolence. I grabbed the nearest object, a silver candlestick, and swung it wildly, the impact sending a shockwave through my arm. The doll shrieked, its form flickering like a dying flame. Dr. Mathers threw a handful of ash into the air, chanting louder, her voice rising above the din. The entity recoiled, its edges fraying, its form becoming less solid. "Finish it!" Dr. Mathers yelled, tossing me a vial of holy water. I uncorked the vial and poured its contents over the diary. The book hissed and smoked, its pages curling as the liquid seeped into the paper. The entity let out a final, ear-splitting scream before dissolving into a plume of black smoke. The room fell silent. The diary was nothing more than a pile of ash, its brass clasp warped and blackened. Dr. Mathers and I sat in silence, both too shaken to speak. Eventually, she broke the quiet. "It's over," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. But as I left her house that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. A week later, I returned to Rosewood Antiquities. The shop was gone, its windows boarded up, a "For Lease" sign hanging crookedly on the door. I told myself it was a coincidence. But as I walked away, I caught a glimpse of something in the alley behind the building, a doll, half buried in the dirt, its waxen face cracked and its glassy eyes wide open. And I swear, it smiled at me.